Hello everyone, Professor Kusluch here. So I wanted to think some more about electoral politics and a central idea that has come up throughout several of our readings and our discussions is this idea of retrospective voting. So we talked about Achen and Bartels Democracy for Realists, where the authors highlight this idea of retrospective voting, and I just wanted to, in this video, dig a little deeper into what that is. So, retrospective voting is this idea that voters make their decisions not by carefully weighing every policy position or campaign promise or party platform, but instead by looking backwards, by judging incumbents based on their past performance. So at first glance, this seems like a pretty reasonable way for a democracy to function. After all, voters don't need to be experts on every single issue. They don't need to know the fine details of economics or the complexity of foreign policy or have access to sensitive information that foreign policymakers have. As one academic once put it, voters just need to notice the results. If jobs have disappeared in a recession, that's a sign something went wrong. If wars are dragging on and military members are continuing to be sent overseas and there isn't an end in sight, that's a sign that something is wrong. If crime is rising in neighborhoods or pollution is destroying an area or a neighborhood, then that's a sign something is wrong. And so by this logic, the average citizen doesn't need a PhD in economics or a PhD in political science to hold leaders accountable. They just need to judge whether life is getting better or worse under the current leadership. So Achen and Bartels Democracy for Realists talks a lot about this idea, but they're of course not the only one. This idea was laid out by Key in the 1960s when he argued that voters are not fools. They are capable of being what he called responsible electorates. Christopher Achen and Larry Bartels, who work we're drawing from today, know that this retrospective theory was appealing because it seemed to save democracy from the harsh criticism that ordinary citizens are too uninformed or disengaged to matter. Instead of demanding that voters have sophisticated opinions on every issue, it only asks them to act as what Key called appraisers of past performance. In that sense, retrospective voting promised both a realistic and a rational account of how democracy actually works. Now, retrospective voting can work in two different ways. First, it can act as a mechanism for selecting competent leaders. The idea here is simple. If a party or a president has done a good job in the past, that's a reasonable clue that they'll do a good job in the future. Second, it can act as a mechanism for sanctioning leaders. Even if there is no inherent difference between candidates, the fact that voters can punish the failure and reward success gives incumbents an incentive to work hard and to work for the constituency. Politicians who know their jobs are on the line are more likely than the public's to take the public's welfare serious and do what the public wants them to do. So then what does this look like in practice? Political history gives us some pretty powerful examples. Take the U.S. in the early 1930s. Voters turned out against Herbert Hoover in the election of 1932 as the Great Depression weakened. Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats swept into power, largely because voters judged Hoover's performance as inadequate in dealing with mass unemployment and the economic collapse brought on by the Great Depression. In that case, retrospective voting helped bring about one of the biggest political realignments in American history. Or consider 1952, when Dwight Eisenhower defeated Stevenson after years of Democratic control. Voters weren't necessarily experts in Korean War strategy, but they knew the war was unpopular and costly. They punished the Democrats for that conflict. An example of retrospective voting. Similarly, in 1974, the shadow of Watergate and economic turmoil hurt Republicans in the midterms as voters punished incumbents for scandals and, again, economic performance. So we see that voters, they might not have to know with this idea. They might not have to know about every policy choice, every policy platform, but if the economy is doing well, if there aren't scandals, then they react positively. So we see this in more modern examples. In 2008, the financial crisis devastated the U.S. economy and created a massive wave of anger against incumbents. The Republican Party, then in control of the White House, suffered a pretty crushing defeat, with Barack Obama winning the presidency on a promise of change. So this is an example of retrospective voting. Tied election outcomes directly to economic performance, where voters saw what was going on in the country, they were frustrated, they wanted change. So we have that laid down. But here's where Achen and Bartels in Democracy for Realists, chapter 4, where they bring this complication. The authors point out that while retrospective voting works in principle, in practice, voters often can't tell what outcomes leaders are actually responsible for. Recessions may be caused by global shocks. Wars may drag on for reasons beyond a president's control. And sometimes voters even punish leaders for truly random events. As the authors bring up, shark attacks on local beaches, floods in distant regions. So scholars call this blind retrospection. Voters lashing out at whoever is in charge, whether or not they are to blame, whether or not their policies, their platforms are to blame. So then here's a bit of a dilemma. Retrospective voting offers a powerful story about accountability. It suggests that even relatively uninformed voters can still discipline politicians and reward competence. But the reality is more complicated. Voters often struggle to sort out what outcome leaders are truly responsible for and which ones are they just happen. They're just random. So media coverage, partisan bias, and randomness all shape perceptions of performance. And when voters get it wrong, when they reward or punish leaders for things out of their control, the democratic promise of accountability looks a little bit shakier. So, okay, to wrap up, because I wanted to keep this relatively short, so to just conclude, to wrap up, retrospective voting is one of the most influential theories of how elections work. It explains why incumbents rise and fall with the economy, why scandals or crises matter so much, and why leaders constantly worry about managing public perceptions. But it also means that democracy can sometimes look arbitrary. When voters behaving less like rational appraisers of performance and more like citizens blindly striking out at whoever happens to be in office. That's the paradox that Achen and Bartels leave us with. Retrospective voting helps make sense of electoral politics, but it also exposes the limits of democratic accountability. Okay, thank you.